All right, for the sake of time, I'm going to go ahead and kick us off. Welcome, everybody. My name is Lauren Lecy, and I'm the manager of grants and research projects at the National Endowment for Financial Education. Thank you all so much for joining today. We're really excited to have Dr. Lou Fan and Dr. Jeffrey Anvari-Clark, two participants in the NEFE Knology Fellowship Program, here to present their work using Knology's database and mapping tool. Dr. Fan is an assistant professor at the University of Georgia, specializing in financial advice seeking, consumer well-being, financial education and socialization, and behavioral finance. And Dr. Anvari-Clark is an assistant professor of social work at the University of North Dakota, with a focus on social work practice, financial social work, and behavioral mental health. They're each going to present their projects today, and we'll save 5 to 10 minutes at the end of each presentation for Q&A, and ask that you save any questions you have for then. When the time comes, the best ways to ask a question are to either raise your hand virtually using the menu at the bottom, and the host will unmute you to ask your question directly to our presenters. We'll unmute folks in the order that we received raised hands. Alternatively, you can also type questions into the chat box, and we will answer them in the order that they are received. Just to not distract our presenters, we ask that you please refrain from using the chat feature before then. I'm also going to drop a link to a short survey at the end of the second Q&A time. And this is meant to just provide feedback on the webinar today. We really value your thoughts and suggestions. It shouldn't take more than a couple minutes to complete. We really appreciate it. And I think that's it. So Lou, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you. And it looks like Sean joined. Sean, I just got us kicked off. Welcome. I don't know if you wanted to say a couple things before Lou got started.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you so much. And apologies for the brief delay joining. So my name is Sean Field. I'm from Knology, and we are sort of the lead researchers on the project that Lou and Jeffrey have then joined and added their own research to. And so just a thank you to NEFE for helping support this work. I will make sure to send out all of the resources that were developed after this call to the folks on the call today. And thank you to Lou and Jeffrey for your awesome work this past year on this, and looking forward to hearing your presentations. And I guess, Lou, it's over to you.
All right. Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Lauren, for the introduction. And I'm Lou, assistant professor at the University of Georgia. I also want to thank NEFE and Knology for this great opportunity to learn and use this database. And I've also started to collaborate with one of the fellows, Yin Ying, on this project. So it was a great opportunity to build connections. So without further ado, I'll present my work during the fellowship I did. It was about the relationship between financial education mandates and perceived financial wellness of young adults. Some background and rationale for this study is that now there are increasing number of states start to require high school financial literacy courses to be implemented in their curricula. So the outcomes of the mandates have become a central issue for many stakeholders. Financial education mandates has shown a correlation with young adults' higher levels of financial knowledge and literacy, and also better financial outcomes. The literature also shows the exposure to mandate financial education is also associated with improved financial well-being, but only to some subgroups like men and those with higher educational attainment. Young adults are in the critical life stages when they transition into adulthood. Researchers found that young adults on average have low financial literacy, and financial concerns has become a major source of financial stress for young adults. And some people may face with heavy student loans and credit card debt. Some may have some financial pressures from their families, and those typical living expenses also create financial challenges for young adults. And compared to older age groups, young adults are more likely to experience financial stress and financial anxiety, especially during those economic downturns, such as the pandemic. So understanding young adults' financial well-being and improving their financial well-being can benefit their financial lives in their later life stages. The purpose of this study is that there has been some studies in the past established the direct relationship between financial education mandates and various financial outcomes, but there hasn't been a study exploring the structural relationships between mandatory financial education and various outcomes, including financial knowledge and inclusion, financial behavior and independence, and perceived financial wellness. So the main two research questions being asked in this study is that first, how financial education mandates are related to these financial outcomes directly and indirectly. And the second is, what are the interrelationships among these behavioral and wellness outcomes of young adults? So this studies develop a conceptual framework based on two sources. And the first is the Sheridan's framework of financial capability, which links financial education to financial knowledge, financial inclusion, financial behavior, and well-being and wellness outcomes. And also there's an extended component of financial independence, which is based on the literature. This is a really important component for young adults when they enter into this or getting adapt into their new social roles. And also it can be important outcomes of financial education mandates. Some literature review about financial education mandates is that the previous studies found it has been found that financial education mandates is closely related to lower likelihood of using costly AFS. It also has association with better and more favorable financing and borrowing behaviors. It can also be linked to improved financial well-being for some populations, and it can also improve students' exposure to financial literacy and ultimately improve their savings performance during their adult lives. Some financial knowledge and inclusion, these two are the important building blocks for financial capability. So research showed that those who receive financial education before showing better financial capability, including improved financial knowledge and positive financial behaviors, perceived capability, and confidence. The improved financial knowledge also shown to be possibly associated with young adults' financial behaviors and well-being. There's also studies showing the importance of improved financial inclusion through being banked or having some access to financial products for individuals. Is also related to their financial wellness, such as better saving outcomes and retirement planning behaviors. For positive financial behavior, such as saving for emergencies and retirement, is associated with less financial anxiety about the financial futures. Financial knowledge is also found to be positively associated with both short-term and long-term positive financial behaviors among millennials. Financial inclusion and access to different financial products are also found to be associated with better financial behaviors, such as saving for emergencies and less likely to use costly borrowing products. For financial independence, young adults who become more financially independent, earning their own lives and paying off their own rents and bills may have a sense of improved financial capability. However, there are evidence showing that taking on such responsibilities may negatively and indirectly related to young adults' subjective well-being. And young adults' economic and psychological factors are significantly associated with their financial independence. There are also research showing that those young adults who became immediately independent very early in adulthood showed high financial insecurity. And lastly, about personal financial wellness, this is a multidimensional concept reflecting both subjective and objective aspects of the current financial conditions, and researchers using some objective aspects such as financial ratios in the past, and found that young adults may experience high financial challenges, which may lead to low perceived financial wellness. And the current study only focuses on these subjective aspects, which is the perceived financial wellness. And in the past literature, some studies use the CFPB's subjective financial well-being scales to study this perceived aspects of financial well-being. Sometimes it's interchangeably used with financial wellness, and is found that it's possibly linked to financial knowledge, capability, and various financial management practice and behaviors. So with that said, based on the Sheridan's framework of financial capability, we have this mandatory financial education exposure on the left-hand side as a direct relationship pointing to financial knowledge and financial inclusion. And then there's also a link between financial knowledge and it's proposed to be positively related to financial inclusion. And on this chart, there's also direct path from financial knowledge, financial inclusion to positive financial behaviors and independence. And all these four factors will have, is proposed to have also direct link to perceived financial wellness. And there's no direct path from mandatory and financial education exposure to perceived wellness. This is based on the original Sheridan's framework of financial capability. The data and sample, the database is also done by the NEFE analogy. So this is also include multiple sources of data on financial education and various financial and life outcomes. Particularly in the current study, I used the pooled shared data from 2017 to 2019. These are the three waves that include the financial leaders, financial knowledge variables. And this is combined with the Urban and Schmeiser data set. And this data set include all those historic data tracking each state's implementation year of the mandatory financial education. The sample is restricted to young adults aged between 18 to 29 years old and at least have a high school diploma. And the final sample size is about 3,800. For the measures, the financial education mandates is coded as a binary variable. If it's a 0, that means they're graduated from high school before the state start to implement the mandatory financial education. And 1 means they graduate from high school after the mandate has started. The financial knowledge is the big 3 Lusardi's knowledge scale. So ranging from 0 to 3, 0 means they get none of the questions correct, and 3 means they have all 3 answered correctly. There are 2 variables measuring financial inclusion. The first is that whether they're banked, and the second is whether they have at least 1 credit card. So both of them are binary variables. And also 2 types of positive financial behaviors. First is that whether they have emergency savings, and what the second is whether they have retirement savings. There are 2 aspects or variables measuring financial independence. The first is whether they are making financial decisions their own, or whether they're the sole financial decision maker in the household. The second is whether they receive no financial support from family. So if this is a 1, that means they receive no financial support, indicating a higher financial independence. For perceived financial wellness, this is a summated score using 3 items. And these 3 items are measuring the perceived aspects of financial wellness. The first is that ask respondents to rate their how well they can manage their financially these days. The second asks compared to the last year, whether their current financial condition is better off, the same, and worse financially. And the third is that compared to their parents around their age, whether they think their personal condition is better, the same, or worse off financially. The structural equation modeling with maximum likelihood estimation is used to analyze both the direct and indirect relationships among the factors or components included in the framework. The socioeconomic and demographic characters and also the graduation year are controlled in all those paths. This page showing the descriptive statistics of the study is showing that about 15% reported they received or being exposed to mandatory financial education in high school. And then the perceived financial wellness is around 9.5 on a scale of 0 to 14. And the average for financial knowledge is 1.6 on a scale of 0 to 3. And you'll see the majority of the respondents showing they have being banked, and close to 33% had at least a credit card. And 38% or 39% had some emergency savings, and 61% have retirement savings. And close to 43% are the independent decision maker for financial matters in their home. And then close to 77% receive no financial support from their family. And this chart showing the direct path in the SEM analysis, and you will see that this financial education mandates shows a positive relationship with financial knowledge. And there's also financial knowledge showing direct and positive relationship with those two financial inclusion variables of being banked and having credit cards. And there are also something related to the interrelationships, but giving the time limit, I'll jump onto the bottom parts. For the perceived financial wellness, the financial knowledge and being banked did not show any statistical significance, but having credit cards is possibly related to perceived financial wellness, and having emergency savings and retirement savings are also showing positive relationship with perceived financial wellness. Interestingly, we found that independent financial decision making and young adults having being an independent financial decision maker in the household is negatively associated with perceived financial wellness, and receiving no financial support from families showing a positive relationship. In the indirect relations, we can see that the financial education mandate has a positive indirect relationship with being banked and credit. And for the credit cards, it was only important on a 10% significance level. And both financial education mandate and financial knowledge showed a positive indirect relationship with emergency savings and retirement savings. Moving down below, here is showing that financial education mandate also showed a marginally significant positive indirect relationship with perceived financial wellness. This was also important at a 10% significance level. And financial knowledge, being banked, and having credit cards, they all showed a positive indirect relationship with perceived financial wellness. So summarizing all these results, I want to just present two main key findings. The first is that this study shows that the mandatory financial education had a direct and positive association with young adult financial knowledge, and an indirect positive association with other financial outcomes, including financial inclusion, positive financial behaviors, and perceived financial wellness. And this is very important for policymakers to start to promote this mandatory financial education, especially to those states who that currently do not have mandatory financial education, to show that this is the important role and positive role of financial education mandatory for young adults in their financial matters. And the second is young adults' financial knowledge showed a direct and positive role in relation to financial inclusion, positive financial behaviors, and financial decision-making independence. It also had an indirect positive relationship with positive financial behaviors and perceived financial wellness. So this is very important to emphasize the role of financial knowledge. So this study did not include whether the young adults still continue to have financial education exposure in their college or workplaces. But for those who did not have the chance to get mandatory financial education in high school, this study showing that it's also important to continue or encourage the young adults to continue to learn more financial knowledge, because this can benefit their financial matters and different aspects of financial lives. And lastly, having credit cards and positive financial behaviors, including saving for emergencies and retirement, and also receiving no financial support, were positively related to young adults' perceived financial wellness. But the independently making financial decisions was negatively associated with perceived financial wellness. I think this is also related to a previous study showing that young adults who have to be immediately becoming financially independent in early adulthood may feel financially insecure, and this may also happen to those individuals who are forced to become financially independent early in their adulthood, because there's also research evidence showing that parents act as one of the most important financial advice sources for a lot of young adults. So for those who do not have those resources may feel very overwhelmed when they have to independently make financial decisions, like to choose mortgages or developing their investment portfolio. So those complex financial decisions may be overwhelming to a lot of young adults who have to make their own financial decisions. To conclude my presentation, I want to also mention some limitations of the current study. Other than those that I mentioned before, there's also a usage of mandate implementation year or the graduation year as a proxy for financial education exposure. This might be a limitation because those states who didn't have mandates, some schools or high schools may still have or offering this financial literacy courses as electives, or start to build some of those economic or financial literacy content in their current curricula, so that students may still have some exposure to financial education, but this study was not able to capture those. And then there's a lack of information on education programs quality. And of course, there are different or various ways to evaluate a financial education program. But then this current study did not include, for example, the teacher's qualification or how the courses were delivered. So there was no information about the education program's quality. And then this, given that the study uses the pooled cross-sectional data sets, the conclusion cannot be causal. Some implications for different stakeholders. I think for policymakers, this study is important for them to start build national guidelines or improve their national guidelines for mandatory financial education to promote the mandates across all states. And for financial educators, it's important to increase the impact of financial education programs and also motivate students to learn and retain knowledge so that they can still remember what they learned from these education courses in their early adulthood. For financial practitioners, they can also provide education to help clients understand the basic financial knowledge and also provide some financial services and advice to assist young adults and their young clients who have to make financial decisions independently and on their own. So with that said, thank you all, everyone, and I'm open to any questions and comments.
Thank you, Lou. As a reminder, you can drop any questions you have into the chat, just making sure you're sharing that message with everybody, or you can raise your hand and I will unmute you.
As I saw there's a webinar chat, you'll ask that if the raw data is available for research purpose. And Lauren answered,
Looks like we got another question from Louisa asking if you could share access to the paper.
Oh, currently this paper is under reviewed. Am open to send the short abstract if you think that would be helpful. And I think this is a really strong data set or database, and encourage everyone to start to check or take a look at those database to learn more about financial education mandates. Thank you, Louisa. And I have my email address on this page in case any of you have any questions or suggestions for this study. You can send me an email.
Any other questions for Lou before we pass it on to Jeffrey? All right, well, let's move on then. And yeah, as a reminder, we will be sharing links to the Knology data set and mapping tool at the end of this webinar. Thank you again, Lou.
Thank you, and thank you, everyone.
Alrighty. So hello, everybody. I'm Jeffrey Anvari-Clark, and I'm going to be sharing my screen here. Okay. Are we seeing the right screen? Looks like you're seeing the presentation there. Alrighty, very good. So thank you so much for everybody joining this, and thank you to Dr. Lou Fan. I'm actually going to be touching on several of the themes that that Dr. Fan has addressed. So we're just kind of picking up, dealing with, again, family well-being and how family influences behavioral practices in terms of how we think about our finances and what we do with them. And so what I wanted to explore in particular was this idea of financial knowledge and financial fragility, which is almost the opposite of this idea of financial well-being. But really kind of then looking at the influence that sharing and receiving money has on that relationship. And so, again, wanted to thank NEFE and Knology for the opportunity to partake in this, the fellowship. And a lot of this idea for why to study this is a kind of the next step on my research agenda of looking at financial interdependence and the relationships that people have with their money, and in particular when they're sharing it. Looking at specifically then this shed all year, or SHEDAY as we call it internally, data set provided a wide range of data to be able to use, and basically was able to do some other more technical things from a scholastic enrichment process and perspective that I was able to dive deep into during the summer. So I really appreciated that opportunity as well. Now, as we think about financial well-being and people sharing money and families supporting each other, I found just this really timely article in the New York Times just this weekend on January 21st. What's that, 2 days ago, where it was looking at East Asian immigrants living in the United States and how it is that they are supporting their parents. And so the parents have not saved any money for retirement, but instead have poured everything into their children with the expectation, and the children know this, that the children are going to be supporting their parents in their retirement. But then here in the United States, the context, that then puts the onus on the children to both save for their own retirement and be interdependently entwined with their parents and supporting their parents as they are retired. So there's this lot of expectation of cultural relationships that go on here. And this is just one form of interdependence that can go on. It can be of something that's very formal and expected within a family, or it can even be just sharing among friends. So we're going to explore this a little bit to see and understand how this impacts the relationship then between one's financial knowledge, and then how well off are they, and what types of precarious financial situations are they in. So that's really what it is that I want to look at. The formal questions then get to looking at, as financial knowledge increases, first off, how likely are people to share and to receive, as well as then to share and receive at the same time in an ongoing way? And then, does this sharing and receiving enhance or reduce the positive impact that knowledge has on financial fragility? Now, one of the benefits of being the second to touch this data set after the folks at Knology is that they did some initial deep digging into the data and found that there is a positive relationship here. So when financial knowledge goes up, financial fragility goes down, and this is good. But then what happens when we bring sharing and receiving into the equation, as often happens? And that's where I wanted to then be able to take the next step. And so this also draws upon the financial literacy model and the financial capability model that was proposed by Sheridan back in 2013. And basically, one of the things that's important to understand, as Dr. Fan mentioned, is that where we get our financial knowledge is not just from in the classroom, in a formal education setting. We may get it from a formal financial advisor. So we go out and get some external professional advice. But a lot of the advice that we get from our family and friends. We get from the people who socialize us. And so this is that idea of financial socialization, which plays a huge, huge role, not only in what we know, but in what we're taught to do. And this is where the cultural aspect of how we think about money and behave towards it, that's very much informed by our parents and what we're taught through the generations. I'll be using also those same big three financial questions. They're called literacy questions, but it's really more financial knowledge. And then looking at who's sharing and receiving this money, again, as a cultural practice. There's a lot of literature, or some, I should say, some literature out there that looks at specific population groups who do a lot of sharing in a very explicit manner, such as African Americans, Mexican Americans, East African immigrants, Australian Aboriginal peoples, and then East Asians. At the same time, there may also be an income level or economic level of activity that goes on where people at the lower economic strata are creating their own safety framework, safety net, if you will. And so they share with each other, and that kind of can go across different racial groups. And so one of the questions that I had was also, well, isn't everybody doing this? Because, I've received a little bit of money on occasion from my family, and, maybe I'll help out somebody else. And yet here I am as a white man. How rare is that? So thinking about that, and then thinking about some of the additional theories that go into this in terms of people helping each other out in times of stress, but then also proactively to serve as a buffer or a cushion or to help them up, such as, maybe receiving an inheritance or a down payment for a house. So that's not in response to emergency, that's in response to helping up. So we've got a lot of these different facets that go into financial interdependence, and I wanted to try cracking this open a little bit more. So when we measure, we had basically two questions to work with out of the SHED data set. One is, do you provide regular financial support out to people living outside of your household? So it could be a parent, child, relatives, or other friends. Or do you receive? And so is somebody providing you with that financial support? And this can be, both cash, but also, maybe help with rent or some groceries, education expenses, childcare, things like that, that would have a monetary value, but it's more of an in-kind. So we're asking those, and these, again, the behavior and that we are taught to do this is typically comes through financial socialization, that people are your family, and so you help them out. That's the underlying piece here. And so it's really just rooted in those deep beliefs. So moving into the study here, used 3 years worth of the SHED data set to really come up with a large group that I could work with. So overall, it was over 35,000 observations, drawing from over 23,000 respondents. And I treated them as single points in time because it's all encapsulated within a 1 year. Am I doing this activity in the course of a year? What's my financial well-being or my financial knowledge in that year? And it may improve or it may get a little bit worse as time goes on, but it's each measurement happens within the same year. So to understand a little bit about who it is that we're looking at, is pretty even split in terms of gender, fairly wide or fairly well-educated, medium income levels, wide range of ages, was predominantly white, but we were able to bring in other identifying racial and ethnic groupings, and then fairly normal-ish income distribution. One of the key factors, though, I wanted to look at was then looking at the sharing, and then did they receive? And so being able to tap those questions would then, I needed enough power, given that it was, wasn't a huge sample size, but this was enough to be working with. So when we, just as a question zero, as a baseline, who is sharing, who's receiving? Is this only something that, people of color do, or is it something that everybody does? Because all of the studies are only focusing on a particular population. And what we found here was that, folks who identified as white, about 21% of them were engaging in some form of activity, whether it was sharing or receiving, or sharing and receiving. And that's not a whole lot different from the other identifying groups. It's a little bit lower, but it's happening. And that's the point. It's not something that's exclusive to one group or another. Point is, it happens in different forms. So that, I thought, was a helpful piece. And then as we were then thinking about what's the likelihood of sharing? So that's, likelihood of sharing would be W, likelihood of receiving as Z, and then sharing and receiving as a person's financial knowledge score improves. I treated financial knowledge in the same way as Dr. Fan, just simply as a cumulative 0 to 3 on a scale of 3 questions and how many they got right. We treated then sharing and receiving as binary. And then I used a financial fragility score that had been compiled by Knology. And so this is an 11-item score based on how likely are you being able to come up with $400 in an emergency? What would you need to rely on? Would you be able to pay it off immediately? Would you have to go into debt? Those types of questions. And so that's where we're looking at, as financial knowledge goes up, what's the impact then on their fragility when you introduce sharing and receiving? And so when we look at sharing and receiving without including any controls here, as a person's financial knowledge score goes up, the likelihood of sharing increases. Okay, well, their knowledge goes up, they're in better, maybe they're applying that knowledge, they're in a better situation, so they can share a little bit more. That makes sense. At the same time, because they're in a better situation, maybe, they won't be as dependent on others, and so they'll be less likely to receive or to ask for assistance from somebody. So receiving goes down, and then sharing and receiving likewise go down. So that was, I think, as expected. However, when we bring in this relationship of a moderating relationship to financial fragility, what we see here is that from a visual place, as we start introducing, say, receiving, they're not receiving, and they're not sharing, that's the dotted line here, that's the steepest slope, which means we've got the greatest relationship and the biggest effect, if you will, within this model context of as financial knowledge goes up, then fragility goes down. However, when we introduce sharing, then the slope flattens out a little bit. And then when we introduce receiving, it flattens out a little bit more. And then finally, when we have sharing and receiving, which is this solid line here, that's where it's at the flattest, meaning that the effect goes away. From a numbers standpoint, we see the size, just simply the absolute size of this decreasing and getting smaller as we introduce sharing and receiving. Now, I think it's important to note here that I did control for state that they were in, because maybe they were under those state mandates to receive financial education, as well as survey year and whatever was happening in the economy. We included race, income, gender, and age. Survey and state and survey year, did not were not significantly significant, but overall the others were. And so what we're seeing then is that, okay, yes, financial knowledge improves, fragility decreases, this is good, but when we introduce this interdependent activity, it has less and less impact. So yes, it moderates the relationship in the course of this model as it was designed. But really, if we're to contextualize this, in other words, if you're a case manager and you've provided maybe some financial education to your client, but then your client helps out their cousin or their auntie has to step in and help them out with a bill, then you're probably not going to be seeing the improved outcome that you would have been hoping in your client's financial situation. Now, I mean, the financial education, probably didn't do any harm, unless, you're being judgmental about this, and in which case, we need to kind of question some of the biases that we bring to the relationship of being a financial counselor and, maybe having judgment on how people are spending their money, because ultimately this comes down to value discussions, and it may not be something that I may have grown up with, but is a deep part of how this other person has been taught to live their life. So again, the financial education probably didn't do any harm, but it didn't help a whole lot either. And so with this hefty dose of reality, we need to think in some of these immediate terms, what kinds of outcomes are we expecting and can reasonably expect when this activity is going on, particularly when it's an important part of the fabric of the culture of the people that you're working with. And so as far as the takeaways here, as we said, likelihood of respondents increases when they, of sharing and of receiving decreases as their financial knowledge improves. That's good. However, when they have the sharing and receiving will inhibit the impact of financial knowledge on reducing financial fragility. So we need to really then be looking then at the role of financial interdependence activity across all populations, not just say, this is specific for this one population, but it's actually something that's being done across the board. And we need to know how widespread is it? Who all is doing it? Is it done more according to socioeconomic class? Is it more of a cultural thing? in what ways is it being done? Is it being done in response to financial shocks, life hitting the fan, and I need to come up with that $400? Or is it done in a proactive way, and so such as this intergenerational transfer of wealth, where it's one generation passing on assets to the next to help buoy them up and help them out a little bit more? And at the same time, then, we need to then be looking at, as we're delivering this financial knowledge, what types of questions are we asking? What's going to be relevant for the family that engages in this type of activity? So financial education needs to account for these cultural expectations of mutual assistance. That said, as I noted, state did not play a significant role in this particular rendering, but in Dr. Phan's, it did. So depending on how you crunch data, sometimes you can find very different results. Again, more data and I think research is going to be needed on that. But it would be important for us to just think about some of these policy mandates and how effective are they. Limitations, it's a secondary data set. I wasn't able to ask the questions myself. Otherwise, I probably would have asked a lot more in terms of, under what context were people sharing or receiving. We had to rely upon, proxies and single variables. Some of them were so-so in terms of the amount of options that people had to choose from and how to identify themselves. At the same time, I was able to determine, the financial fragility measure could be a little bit more robust, but that gives us a place to work with and something to go from. At the same times, this was a probabilistic analysis. Some aspects were generalizable, but probably not the whole thing. So we do want to just take it with a grain of understanding there. But ultimately, this really emphasizes and advances the importance of multicultural influences on financial well-being, and that how we're measuring and how we're thinking about this and these concepts of independence versus interdependence may not be applicable to everybody across the board. And there may be very different understandings in how questions are being interpreted, as well as then what people are doing and what's considered appropriate behavior from a cultural context, rather than a purely independent, financial independence context. There are my references. And so at this time, would like to thank you for joining and open it up for any questions. My contact information is there.
Any questions for Jeffrey? In the meantime, I'm going to drop the link to the survey about this webinar in the chat. Again, we appreciate you filling it out if you have a moment.
Excuse me, as mentioned, I will be sharing all the resources with you all who are attending this webinar. That includes a webinar that was recorded back in November of last year that describes what is available within the database and some of the original research that was done, and as well as some of the reporting on that project. So be on the lookout for an email from me over the next week or so. And eventually we will also be featuring the work of Dr. Anvari-Clark and Dr. Fan on our website as well. So you'll have a place to find that as well there. Thank you both for your presentation today.
Additionally, I just wanted to say that we have our final webinar in this series featuring the remaining 2 fellows, Ying Zhang and Dr. Thomas Karanke. That is on February 22nd at the same time, 2:30 to 3:30 Mountain Time. If you received an email about this webinar or past webinars, you'll also be receiving an email about that one. Find it on our social media. We hope to have you attend that one as well to complete the series. All right, well, if we don't have any questions, I think we'll go ahead and wrap up. Thank you both again for your wonderful presentations. Like we said, we'll be in touch with links to the Knology information and be on the lookout for an email about the next webinar. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, friends.